20th of August, 1941, a date that would forever change the course of the Eastern Front and transform an obscure Soviet tank commander into a legend whispered across the frozen battlefields of Russia. On this humid summer morning, as German bombers roared overhead toward Leningrad, a single Soviet heavy tank lay buried in the earth beside a swamp, its commander watching patiently through his periscope. The man behind those cold, calculating eyes was Senior Lieutenant Zinovy Grigorievich Kolobanov, and within the next 30 minutes, he would accomplish something so extraordinary that his own superiors would refuse to believe it. The story of Zinovy Kolobanov began not in a military academy or a grand city, but in the dusty poverty of a farming village called Arifino in Vladimir Province. Born on the 25th of December, 1910, into a family of poor peasants, young Zinovy knew hardship before he could walk. His father worked the land with calloused hands, scratching survival from the unyielding Russian earth. The family had nothing, no wealth, no prospects, no path out of generational poverty. Yet they had something that would prove more valuable than gold: resilience forged in the crucible of rural hardship. Tragedy struck when Zinovy was merely 10 years old. His father, like so many Russian men of that generation, perished in the chaos of the civil war that tore the nation apart following the 1917 revolution. Left with his mother and the brothers, Zinovy suddenly understood that survival demanded more than passive acceptance of fate. The death of his father planted within him a seed of determination that would later bloom on the battlefields of the Great Patriotic War. The family relocated to the village of Grand Zagorino during the late 1920s, arriving just as collectivization swept through the Soviet countryside. Here, young Zinovy learned the rhythms of communal farming, the backbreaking labor, the dependence on weather and fortune, the intimate knowledge of terrain that only those who work the land can possess. He learned to read the earth, to understand how ground could support weight or swallow machinery whole, to recognize the tactical value of high ground and hidden approaches. These were not lessons taught in any classroom, but they would prove invaluable when German panzers came rolling toward Leningrad. Education offered a path forward, and Kolobanov proved himself an exceptional student. He enrolled at Gorky Industrial College, throwing himself into his studies with the same intensity his father had once devoted to working the fields. By his third year, the young man from the farming village had distinguished himself academically, earning the respect of instructors who recognized something special burning within him. But in 1933, destiny intervened. The Red Army called, and like millions of young Soviet men, Zinovy Kolobanov answered. He would later recall that from the moment he entered military service, he knew he had found his true calling. The structure, the camaraderie, the sense of purpose all resonated with something deep within the peasant boy who had lost his father to war and found himself drawn inexorably toward the profession of arms. According to biographical accounts documented by Russian military historians, Kolobanov was initially assigned to the 70th Rifle Division as a cadet. His aptitude for military matters quickly became apparent, and he earned the distinction of choosing his own posting upon graduation, a rare honor, reserved for the most promising officers. Without hesitation, he selected Leningrad, the great northern metropolis that would later become the site of history's most devastating siege. The Franz Orlov Armored School transformed the farmer's son into a tank commander. Graduating with honors in 1936, Kolobanov received his lieutenant's commission and began what would become a remarkable military career. He served as tank commander in the 3rd Separate Tank Battalion of the Leningrad Military District, steadily ascending through the ranks as his superiors recognized his natural gifts for armored warfare. By 1938, Kolobanov had completed command training courses that prepared him for the ultimate responsibility, leading men into battle. His rise had been meteoric by Soviet standards, propelled by talent, dedication, and that intangible quality that separates ordinary soldiers from exceptional commanders. Yet nothing in his training could fully prepare him for what lay ahead: the brutal crucible of the Winter War against Finland, where young Lieutenant Kolobanov would first taste the horror and glory of armored combat. December of 1939 brought the Soviet Union into conflict with tiny Finland, and Lieutenant Kolobanov received orders that would test everything he had learned. Just days before the Winter War erupted, he was appointed commander of a tank company in the 1st Light Tank Brigade, tasked with the seemingly impossible mission of breaking through the legendary Mannerheim Line, a formidable network of fortifications that Finnish engineers had constructed across the Karelian Isthmus. The Winter War would prove to be a disaster for the Soviet Union, exposing catastrophic failures in military leadership, logistics, and tactical doctrine. Joseph Stalin's purges of the officer corps in the late 1930s had gutted the Red Army of experienced commanders, leaving inexperienced officers to lead poorly equipped troops against a determined and resourceful enemy. The Finnish soldiers, fighting for their homeland, exploited every advantage their harsh terrain offered, transforming the frozen forests into killing grounds where Soviet columns died by the thousands. For tank commanders like Kolobanov, the Winter War presented nightmarish conditions. Temperatures plunged to -40 degrees Celsius, causing equipment to malfunction and men to freeze in their tracks. The Finnish defenders employed devastating tactics against Soviet armor, using Molotov cocktails and improvised explosives to transform invincible-seeming tanks into blazing death traps. Tank crews learned a terrible truth. Inside their steel coffins, fire was the enemy most feared. Kolobanov experienced this horror firsthand not once, not twice, but 3 separate times. On 3 occasions during the Winter War, his tank was set ablaze by Finnish defenders, forcing him to escape from burning vehicles while under enemy fire. Each time, he emerged alive through some combination of skill, courage, and sheer fortune. Each time, he returned to combat, climbing into another tank to continue the fight. The experience would have broken lesser men, but Kolobanov emerged from each inferno with his resolve strengthened and his tactical acumen sharpened. The scars of those burning tanks, both physical and psychological, would remain with him forever. But so too would the lessons learned in those desperate moments. He understood, in a way that peacetime training could never teach, how tanks could be destroyed. He understood the terror of being trapped in a metal box while flames consumed everything around him. And he understood that survival in armored warfare depended on seeing the enemy before they saw you, on choosing ground that negated the opponent's advantages, on patience and preparation, and the willingness to act decisively when opportunity presented itself. Despite the overall catastrophe of the Soviet campaign, Kolobanov distinguished himself repeatedly during the fighting. His performance during the breakthrough of the Mannerheim Line earned him recognition from his superiors, and according to various historical accounts, he was nominated for the title Hero of the Soviet Union, the highest honor the Soviet state could bestow upon its warriors. Some sources indicate he received this award. Others suggest the nomination was later rescinded due to an incident that would haunt him throughout his career. The nature of this incident remains somewhat unclear in historical records. Some accounts suggest Kolobanov was accused of fraternizing with the enemy, possibly involving humane treatment of Finnish prisoners or wounded soldiers. In the paranoid atmosphere of Stalin's Soviet Union, such behavior, however morally commendable, could be interpreted as disloyalty. The accusation, whether justified or fabricated, resulted in Kolobanov being stripped of his captain's rank and reduced to senior lieutenant. In the months following the Winter War, Kolobanov worked to rebuild his reputation and prepare for conflicts yet to come. He continued refining his understanding of armored warfare, studying the lessons of the Finnish campaign and incorporating them into his tactical thinking. The bitter experience of losing 3 tanks to enemy action had taught him the supreme importance of terrain selection, concealment, and the devastating effectiveness of ambush tactics against armored columns. 22nd of June, 1941, a date burned into Russian collective memory as indelibly as Pearl Harbor, would be burned into American consciousness just months later. On this Sunday morning, more than 3 million German soldiers, supported by thousands of tanks and aircraft, smashed across the Soviet border in the largest military operation in human history. Operation Barbarossa had begun, and the Great Patriotic War engulfed the Soviet Union in fire and blood. The scale of the German offensive defied comprehension. Along a front stretching nearly 2,000 kilometers, Wehrmacht and Waffen-SS formations advanced with terrifying speed and efficiency. Soviet units, caught unprepared despite numerous intelligence warnings, disintegrated under the onslaught. In the opening weeks of the campaign, the Red Army lost over 1 million men killed, wounded, or captured. Thousands of tanks and aircraft were destroyed, often before they could even engage the enemy. Cities fell in rapid succession as Panzer spearheads drove deep into Soviet territory. For tank commanders like Kolobanov, the summer of 1941 presented an almost impossible situation. The Red Army possessed numerical superiority in tanks, fielding over 20,000 armored vehicles at the war's outbreak. But most of these were obsolete light tanks, and even the excellent T-34 and KV-1 heavy tanks were scattered in small packets, rather than concentrated for decisive effect. German tactical superiority, combined with devastating air attacks and the paralysis of Soviet command structures, negated Soviet advantages in equipment and manpower. By early July, Kolobanov found himself transferred to the 1st Tank Regiment of the 1st Tank Division, part of the desperate defense of the approaches to Leningrad. The city of his choice, the place where he had built his career, now faced annihilation. Army Group North, commanded by Field Marshal Wilhelm Ritter von Lieb, drove relentlessly toward the great northern metropolis, seeking to encircle and starve it into submission. The German advance toward Leningrad represented a strategic disaster in the making. For the Soviet Union, the city held enormous symbolic significance as the birthplace of the Bolshevik Revolution. Its fall would represent a propaganda triumph of incalculable value for the Nazi regime. Practically, Leningrad's capture would free German forces for operations elsewhere and eliminate a major center of Soviet war production. Every kilometer the Germans advanced brought catastrophe closer. August brought the crisis to its peak. On the night of August 7th and 8th, German units of the 4th Panzer Group launched renewed offensives from positions near the Luga line, where they had been stalled for nearly a month. The 9th of August saw the 1st Tank Division break through Soviet defenses and link up with the 6th Tank Division, threatening to unhinge the entire Soviet defensive position. By August 14th, German forces had cut the Krasnogvardsk-Sep railway. 2 days later, they captured Volosovo Station and drove toward Krasnogvardsk, the old name for the city of Gatchina, located just 26 miles from Leningrad itself. Soviet troops defending the Luga line, including the 70th, 111th, 177th, and 235th Infantry Divisions, along with the 1st and 3rd People's Militia Divisions, found themselves cut off from the main forces and surrounded. They continued to resist stubbornly, but their situation grew more desperate by the hour. The road to Leningrad lay increasingly open. It was in this apocalyptic context that Senior Lieutenant Zinovy Kolobanov received his fateful orders. On August 18th, he was personally summoned by Major General V. Baranov, commander of the 1st Red Banner Tank Division. The meeting took place in the basement of the cathedral in Krasnogvardsk location. That underscored the desperate nature of the situation. With division headquarters forced into makeshift accommodations as the enemy closed in, Baranov's orders were stark and uncompromising. Kolobanov was to take his tank company 5 KV-1 heavy tanks, the most powerful armored vehicles in the Soviet arsenal, and block 3 roads leading to Krasnogvardsk from the towns of Kingisepp, Volosovo, and Luga. The implicit message behind the verbal orders was clear: hold these roads at all costs, fight to the last man if necessary, and buy time for Leningrad's defenses to be strengthened. The task seemed impossible. 5 tanks against the might of multiple German panzer divisions, tasked with blocking 3 separate approach routes to a strategically vital city. Yet Kolobanov accepted his orders without hesitation. The farmer's son, who had survived 3 burning tanks in Finland, who had been stripped of his rank for showing humanity to the enemy, now faced the supreme test of his military career.
Kolobanov understood that conventional tactics would guarantee failure. 5 tanks, however powerful, could not hope to stop the German advance through direct confrontation. The Wehrmacht's panzer divisions possessed overwhelming numerical superiority, excellent coordination between armor and infantry, and devastating air support that could annihilate Soviet tank formations in the open. To succeed, or even to survive, Kolobanov would need to fight smarter, not harder. The lessons of his farming youth and his bitter experience in Finland crystallized into a tactical plan that would exploit every advantage the terrain offered. Kolobanov personally reconnoitered the approaches to Krasnogvardsk, studying the roads, the surrounding ground, the fields of fire, and the potential killing zones. His practiced eye, trained by years of working the land and refined by combat experience, identified opportunities that less observant commanders might have missed. The key insight came when Kolobanov examined the road network near the settlements of Mizavoskovici, Sepelevo, and Vangostarosta, the latter now known as Novi Yokos. Here, the only road in the region passed through a narrow corridor bounded by swampland on both sides. The soft, waterlogged ground would be impassable for German tanks attempting to maneuver off the road. Any armored column using this route would be channeled into a narrow killing ground with no room to deploy or escape. This was the crazy trick that would define Kolobanov's place in history. Rather than positioning his tanks to engage the enemy in a mobile battle where German numerical superiority would prove decisive, he would transform the terrain itself into a weapon. The swampy ground would become an ally, the narrow road a death trap, the hidden tanks invisible executioners waiting to spring their ambush. On August 19th, Kolobanov led his 5 KV-1 tanks to their assigned positions. Each vehicle carried double the normal ammunition-loaded decision that reflected Kolobanov's expectation of heavy combat and his determination to fight until his tanks ran dry. 2/3 of the shells were armor-piercing rounds, selected specifically for engaging enemy tanks. The commander knew exactly what kind of battle he intended to fight. The disposition of his small force reflected careful tactical thinking. 2 tanks were positioned near Greater Bornitsa, 2 more near Viskovitsy Farm, and Kolobanov himself took position near Greater Chernitsy, directly opposite the T-shaped intersection where the main road branched. Each tank was dug into a hull-down position, with only its turret visible above the earthen embankment. Camouflage netting and natural vegetation concealed the vehicles from aerial observation and casual ground reconnaissance. Kolobanov's KV-1, designated number 864, occupied the most critical position. From this vantage point, approximately 300 meters from the road, the tank commanded a clear view of approaching traffic while remaining nearly invisible to anyone traveling along the route. The commander had selected 2 landmarks for his gunner, the first, 2 birch trees marking the end of the intersection, and the second, the intersection itself. These reference points would ensure that the first shots would box the enemy column into the killing zone. The KV-1 heavy tank represented the pinnacle of Soviet armored vehicle design at this stage of the war. Weighing approximately 46 tons, it mounted a 76mm main gun capable of destroying any German tank then in service at combat ranges. More importantly for the ambush Kolobanov planned, the KV-1's armor up to 90mm thick on the frontal surfaces, with additional Applik armor plates adding further protection, was virtually impervious to the standard German tank guns of 1941. The German panzer divisions approaching Krasnogvardsk were equipped primarily with Panzer II and Panzer III tanks. The former mounted only a 20mm cannon, completely useless against KV-1 armor at any range. The latter carried a 37mm gun, the same weapon German soldiers would nickname the door knocker for its inability to penetrate modern tank armor. Against the KV-1's thick hide, these weapons could do nothing more than announce the presence of their wielders. This asymmetry in firepower and protection formed the foundation of Kolobanov's tactical plan. His tanks could destroy German vehicles at ranges where return fire posed no threat whatsoever. As long as his position remained concealed until the last possible moment, he could achieve devastating results before the enemy even understood what was happening. On the evening of August 19th, Kolobanov gathered his tank commanders and issued his final orders. The other 4 tanks were to hold their fire until explicitly commanded to engage or until their positions were directly threatened. Kolobanov wanted to conceal the true size of his force as long as possible, preventing the Germans from understanding the nature of the trap until it was too late. Only his tank would initiate the ambush. The others would remain hidden in reserve, ready to exploit the chaos he intended to create. The dawn broke over the Russian countryside on August 20th, 1941, revealing a landscape of devastating beauty fields golden with unharvested grain, birch forests swaying in the summer breeze, and the dark waters of the swamp reflecting the pale morning light. The thunder of German Junkers 88 bombers passing overhead toward Leningrad shattered the pastoral quiet, a reminder that somewhere beyond the horizon, the greatest city of the north awaited its fate. The crew of tank number 864 maintained their vigilance through the early morning hours. Driver-mechanic Nikolai Ivanovich Nikiforov kept the engine at idle, ready to move at a moment's notice. Senior Sergeant Andrei Mikhailovich Yusov, the gunner, remained at his position, his eye never straying far from the gun sight that framed the distant road. Loader Pavel Ivanovich Kiselkov waited beside the ready rack of armor-piercing shells, and radio operator Senior Sergeant maintained contact with the other tanks in the company. At approximately 10 o'clock in the morning, the sound of distant gunfire reached Kolobanov's position. Radio traffic confirmed that one of the other crews had engaged German tanks approaching from a different direction. The battle for Krasnogvardsk had begun, and Kolobanov knew his moment was approaching. Hours passed in tense anticipation. Then, at approximately 1400 hours, a column of German motorcycles appeared on the road, their engines buzzing like angry insects as they passed through the intersection. This was the advanced reconnaissance element of a larger force, confirming that enemy armor was following close behind. Kolobanov instructed his crew to remain motionless, allowing the motorcyclist to pass unmolested. The bait was not yet in the trap. The German tank column appeared shortly afterward, emerging from the forest and proceeding confidently along the road toward Novgorodisk. Through his periscope, Kolobanov could see German tankmen sitting casually on their vehicles, hatches open, clearly believing themselves beyond the reach of serious Soviet resistance. Their arrogance would cost them dearly. As detailed in Soviet military records preserved in the Central Archive of the Ministry of Defense, the German column consisted of 22 tanks, primarily Panzer IIs and Panzer IIIs, accompanied by towed artillery pieces. They moved in a loose formation, maintaining intervals appropriate for road march rather than combat operations. Not one among them suspected that death awaited at the innocent-looking intersection ahead. Kolobanov allowed the head of the column to reach his first reference point, the two birch trees at the end of the intersection, before giving the order to fire. Gunner Yusov, who had been tracking the lead tank for long seconds, pressed the firing pedal with his foot. The 76mm gun roared, and an armor-piercing shell screamed across the 300-meter gap at supersonic velocity. The lead German tank exploded in a ball of fire, its thin armor no match for the Soviet shell. The burning wreck blocked the road ahead, creating the first element of Kolobanov's trap. The German column ground to a halt, confused by the sudden destruction of their leading vehicle. Some assumed the tank had struck an anti-tank mine, a logical conclusion given that no enemy position was visible. Before the Germans could react, Yusov fired again, destroying the second tank in the column. Now Kolobanov shifted his attention to the rear of the formation, instructing his gunner to target the trailing vehicles and seal the trap completely. 4 more shots destroyed the last 2 tanks in the column, boxing the remaining German vehicles in a narrow stretch of road with burning wrecks blocking both ends. Panic swept through the German formation. Tank commanders screamed orders, drivers attempted to maneuver, gunners searched desperately for targets. But the terrain that Kolobanov had chosen with such care now revealed its deadly nature. When German tanks attempted to leave the road and find fighting room in the adjacent fields, their narrow tracks sank into the swampy ground, immobilizing them as surely as if they had been chained in place. The slaughter that followed lasted for approximately 30 minutes, though to the Germans trapped in the killing zone, it must have seemed an eternity. Yusuf fired round after round into the helpless column, destroying tank after tank with methodical precision. Some German vehicles managed to identify the source of the fire and return shots at Kolobanov's position, but their 37mm shells bounced harmlessly off the KV-1's heavy armor. The tank shuddered with each impact, but the crew inside remained unharmed. At one point during the battle, as documented in various historical accounts, a German round struck the KV-1's turret traverse mechanism, jamming it in place. Unable to rotate the turret to engage new targets, Kolobanov ordered driver Nikiforov to maneuver the entire tank, using the hull's orientation to aim the gun. This improvised technique, born of desperation and quick thinking, allowed the crew to continue engaging enemies even with critical damage to their vehicle. Radio operator Kiselkov performed his own act of heroism during the battle. When German fire destroyed several of the tank's external observation devices, Kiselkov climbed onto the hull under fire to replace the damaged equipment, exposing himself to enemy rounds to restore his commander's situational awareness. The courage required for such an action, performed while shells screamed overhead and explosions rocked the battlefield, defied easy description. When the guns finally fell silent, the road that would later be known as Tank Alley presented a vision of mechanical apocalypse. 22 German tanks lay destroyed or abandoned, their hulls still smoking from the fires that had consumed them. Scattered among the wrecks were the remains of 2 towed artillery pieces and countless German soldiers who had died trying to escape the inescapable. One Soviet KV-1 tank, dug into the earth beside a swamp, had accomplished what should have been impossible. Kolobanov's crew counted 156 separate impact marks on their vehicle's armor. Not a single German shell had penetrated the KV-1's protective hide. The heavy tank had absorbed everything the enemy could throw at it and continued fighting, a testament both to Soviet engineering and to the courage of the men inside who had refused to abandon their mission despite the battering their vehicle endured. But the Battle of August 20th was not yet complete. After exhausting his ammunition against the first column, Kologanov called forward another KV-1 from his company to continue the engagement. A second German column, attempting to advance along a different approach route, encountered the waiting Soviet tanks and met a similar fate. By day's end, Kolobanov's 5-tank company had destroyed 43 German tanks, virtually annihilating the armored strength of the forces attempting to advance on Krasnogvardisk from that direction. As reported by Tank Archives, a specialized historical research source that has analyzed original Soviet military documents, Lieutenant Kolobanov's company destroyed 42 enemy tanks that day, plus 1 tankette, 1 passenger car, a flamethrower battery, and approximately a company's worth of German infantry. The scale of destruction was almost unprecedented in the annals of armored warfare. Kologanov did not rest on his laurels. In the days and weeks following the Great Ambush, he continued to lead his tanks against the German advance. Historical records indicate that he destroyed at least 3 more enemy tanks and 4 anti-tank guns in subsequent engagements, bringing his total personal tally to approximately 26 enemy armored vehicles destroyed over a period of roughly 26 days, from the battles leading up to August 20th through his continued operations in September. The German response to the catastrophic losses at Tank Alley reflected their frustration and growing respect for Soviet heavy armor. Officers who survived the ambush reported encountering an apparently invincible enemy that shrugged off their most powerful weapons while destroying vehicle after vehicle with terrifying accuracy. The 37mm gun that had seemed adequate against Polish and French tanks proved utterly useless against the new generation of Soviet heavy armor. For the Wehrmacht, the encounters with KV-1 tanks during the summer of 1941 represented a shocking revelation. German intelligence had failed to appreciate the capabilities of the newest Soviet designs, and frontline units paid the price for this failure in blood. The famous 88mm anti-aircraft gun was increasingly pressed into service as an anti-tank weapon, often the only weapon available that could defeat KV-1 armor at combat ranges. Soviet commanders initially greeted Kolobanov's after-action report with disbelief. The claim that a single tank had destroyed 22 enemy vehicles in one engagement seemed too extraordinary to accept, particularly during a period when Soviet forces were suffering catastrophic defeats on every front. Kolobanov's superiors suspected exaggeration, perhaps an attempt by a disgraced officer to rehabilitate his reputation through inflated kill claims. Investigation of the battlefield, however, confirmed every element of Kolobanov's report. The burned-out hulks of German tanks still lined the road, mute testimony to the destruction wrought by a single KV-1 and its crew. The physical evidence was irrefutable. Zinovy Kolobanov had achieved something remarkable, a tactical victory that deserved recognition at the highest levels. The commander of the 1st Tank Regiment, following established procedures, nominated Kolobanov for the title Hero of the Soviet Union. His gunner, Senior Sergeant Andrei Yusov, was similarly nominated for the Order of Lenin. The recommendations worked their way through the Soviet military bureaucracy, eventually reaching the headquarters of the Leningrad Front for final approval. And there, inexplicably, the nominations were altered. Instead of receiving the Hero of the Soviet Union, the medal that his actions had so clearly earned, Kolobanov was awarded the Order of the Red Banner. Yusov received the Order of Lenin as originally recommended. The decision to downgrade Kolobanov's award has never been satisfactorily explained and continues to generate controversy among military historians to this day. The glory of August 20th proved fleeting. Kolobanov continued to fight through the darkening days of late summer and early autumn, as the German noose around Leningrad drew ever tighter. By early September, the situation had become catastrophic. German forces captured Schlisselburg on the 8th of September, completing the encirclement of the city and beginning what would become the deadliest siege in human history. For the men defending the approaches to Leningrad, each day brought new horrors and new opportunities for heroism. Kolobanov and his crew fought on, destroying enemy tanks and anti-tank guns whenever the opportunity arose, buying time with their blood for the city they had sworn to protect. The KV-1 tanks, for all their power, could not reverse the tide of the German advance. They could only make the enemy pay dearly for every kilometer of Soviet soil. On the 15th of September 1941, Kolobanov's war came to a sudden and violent end. Near the city of Pushkin, just south of Leningrad, his tank had stopped to refuel and rearm a routine operation performed countless times during the desperate fighting of the past weeks. A German artillery shell exploded nearby, and fragments of red-hot metal tore through the commander's position. Kolobanov suffered grievous wounds to his head and spine. Shrapnel penetrated his skull and damaged his spinal cord, injuries that would have killed most men outright. Only the immediate attention of his crew and the subsequent evacuation to medical facilities saved his life, though saved perhaps describes the outcome inadequately, given the years of suffering that would follow. The wounded commander was initially treated at the Traumatology Institute of Leningrad, but as the siege tightened and the city's medical facilities became overwhelmed with casualties, he was evacuated to hospitals in Sverdlovsk, deep in the Ural Mountains far from the fighting. There, over the course of nearly 4 years, military surgeons labored to repair the damage the German shell had wrought. Kolobanov remained in hospital until the 15th of March, 1945, missing virtually the entire remainder of the war that his heroism had helped delay. He received promotions during his convalescence, rising to the rank of captain by